Rowan felt her phone buzz incessantly in her pocket. She sat in the cramped, cold room at the sheriff's department. The stark fluorescent lights overhead seemed to make every scuff mark on the linoleum floor stand out in high definition. Every scratch on the metal table she sat at looked like a scar. "We're just trying to understand what happened, Miss Townsend," said Sheriff Wallace, a heavy-set man with a weary face. "Your partner Loren is a person of interest in several horrifying incidents." "I've already told you what I know," Rowan retorted, her patience fraying at the edges. "I didn't see what happened. I came outside when I heard the shots." Sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "You realize how serious this is? Loren is all over the news. People are afraid. They want answers." "So do I," she whispered, thinking about how Loren's actions had torn apart any semblance of normalcy they'd managed to build. A knock on the door interrupted the tense silence. One of the deputies popped his head in. "Sheriff, you need to see this." The sheriff grumbled under his breath and stood up. "We'll continue this later, Miss Townsend. Don't go anywhere." As the door shut behind him, Rowan picked up her phone. Multiple missed calls and texts from unknown numbers, but one name caught her eye: Mom. She debated whether or not to call back, her thumb hovering over the screen, before she could make up her mind. The phone buzzed in her hand. "An incoming call from Dad." Sighing, she answered it. "Hello?" "Rowan, what's going on? We saw the news, so Loren. Are you involved in this?" Her heart sank. She hadn't spoken to her parents since the night she was changed, when she lied to them, since her old life had ended and her new one began. "Mom and Dad, I can't talk about it right now. I'm at the sheriff's department. They're questioning me." "Questioning you? Rowan, tell me you're not involved in whatever Loren's done." "I'm not," she lied, her voice trembling. Her dad's voice took on an unfamiliar edge. "You don't sound like yourself. Have you changed that much since you've been with this man?" "It's complicated," Rowan murmured. The mother's voice chimed in, taking over the speaker. "Rowan, you need to come home. This isn't safe. We don't even know who this Loren really is anymore. He hasn't been the same since the wreck, so we don't know what has happened to him since then." Rowan felt trapped. How could she explain what Loren was, what she was now, and the intricate web they were caught in? She couldn't. "Mom, Dad, I have to go. I promise I'll explain everything later." Her mother's voice was tinged with worry and something darker, suspicion. "You better, Rowan. You can't keep hiding whatever it is you're hiding." The call ended abruptly, leaving Rowan to stew in her own disquiet. She stared at the walls, grappling with the sudden weight of her dual life, feeling the pull of her old world and her new one, both unraveling at the seams. Their parents were suspicious. The law enforcement community was on high alert, and Loren, the epicenter of her current life, had spiraled into something unrecognizable, becoming a symbol of terror she never knew he could be. Her mind raced back to Loren's recent actions, to the man he had become, fueled, it seemed, by a darker, more uncontrollable part of him. And now, he was out there somewhere, wounded, exposed, and as dangerous as ever. She was jolted out of her reverie by the door opening. Sheriff Wallace came back in, his face grave. "We'll need to hold you for further questioning. A lot more questions have arisen that need answers, and given your association with Loren, you're our best shot at getting them." Sheriff Wallace returned to his seat, flipping open a notepad. He shot her a scrutinizing look, as though he could bore into her soul and extract the truth. "We've been looking at your phone records. The last call Loren made was to you. Can you explain that?" Rowan clenched her fists beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. She had to be careful. Every word could be a trap, a slip that might expose her or Loren further. "We were coordinating some work stuff." "Work stuff," Sheriff Wallace repeated, his eyes not leaving her face. "And this work stuff would require a call right around the time of a mass incident?" "It was unrelated," she insisted, striving to keep her voice steady. "I find that hard to believe," Miss Townsend, Wallace said, scribbling something in his notepad. "Be sure you don't know where Loren might be hiding?" Rowan hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. Lying could add another layer of suspicion, but telling the truth, or even a sliver of it, could put Loren in even graver danger. I told you, I don't know. Loren and I have both been busy lately. We haven't spent much time together. Wallace sighed, rubbing his temples. Very well. You'll remain here for now. We'll be in touch with your parents about your situation. So the moment the door clanged shut behind him, a sense of isolation washed over Rowan like a dark wave. She was now a woman at the crossroads of multiple dilemmas, caught between the demands of her hidden nature and the increasingly curious eyes of the world around her. And with Loren on the run, branded a monster in the eyes of the public, her worries multiplied. As if echoing her thoughts, her phone buzzed. A message notification flashed on the screen. Unknown number. With a sense of foreboding, she opened it. It was a video message. The thumbnail alone made her heart lurch. It was Loren. She pressed play. Loren appeared on the screen. His face was drawn, and his eyes bloodshot. He looked worse for wear, clearly drained from his injuries and whatever else he had gone through. Rowan, if you're watching this, I need you to know that you have to stay away from me. I can't control it any longer. The hunger, the rage, it's all blurring together. I love you, and that's why you have to promise not to find me. Take care of yourself. The video cut off abruptly, leaving Rowan stunned. He was losing control. This darker aspect of their vampiric nature was consuming him. A realization sank in. She had to find Loren before it was too late, for him and for her. The door opened again. A deputy came in, holding a tray with a paper cup of water and some packaged snacks. Sheriff says you'll be here for a while. Thought you might need this. Rowan nodded her thanks, her mind racing. She had to act fast. There were so many hurdles: escaping police custody undetected, not alerting her already suspicious parents, and finding Loren, whose last known whereabouts were unknown. As the deputy left, locking the door behind him, Rowan examined the room meticulously. No windows, one door, a surveillance camera in the corner. She needed to disable the camera temporarily, just long enough to make her move. Her vampire abilities gave her heightened senses, speed, and strength, but she had to be careful not to arouse any further suspicion. She glanced at the tray, her eyes falling on the paper cup of water. An idea formed. Standing up, she accidentally knocked the tray off the table, sending the cup tumbling across the room. As it hit the floor, water splashed high, some of it spraying onto the camera lens. Seizing the momentary blind spot this would create, Rowan moved with inhuman speed. She stood on the chair and pulled a ceiling tile free, creating a hole large enough for her to slip through. Taking a deep breath and casting one last glance at the life she was leaving behind. At least for now, she hoisted herself into the cavity above the ceiling. Every second counted. She crawled through the dark, confined space, guided by the layout of the sheriff's department she had memorized during her previous visits. Finally, she reached an area above a storage room. Pushing aside the ceiling tile, she dropped down, landing silently on her feet. Rowan quickly located a set of civilian clothes from a lost and found box. She changed, discarding her own clothes in a trash bag. Before leaving, she caught her reflection in a mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, someone caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Steeling herself for the road ahead, Rowan exited the storage room, blending in with the sparse night shift employees who were none the wiser. She knew she didn't have much time before her disappearance would be noticed, and an all-points bulletin could be put out for her arrest. She slipped out a side exit and into the inky night. The cool breeze sent a shiver down her spine, but there was no turning back now. Rowan began her search for Loren, relying on whatever leads she could gather. She reached out to contacts in the vampire community. Some she had met through Loren, and others she had forged relationships with in secret. The underground network was tight-knit, with members often looking out for one another, especially when faced with a common enemy: exposure. With nowhere else to go and a cloud of uncertainty hanging over her, Rowan fled to Loren's secluded home, tucked away in the outskirts of the small town. It was a modern and remote cabin, built with more than the average amount of secrecy in mind. Though the place offered some refuge from the outside world, Rowan couldn't shake off the creeping sensation that she was trapped. And with each passing hour, the void left by Loren's absence grew more unbearable. She spent days there in a restless limbo, combing through Loren's belongings in hopes of finding clues to his mysterious actions and current whereabouts. Books on vampire lore, handwritten notes, and cryptic messages filled the rooms. She took some time to catch up on her own needs as well, cautiously hunting small game in the surrounding woods to satiate her thirst for blood. Her efforts to maintain a low profile came to an abrupt halt on the fourth night. Flashing lights penetrated the thick curtains, and the distinct sound of car engines revving broke the silence. It was the sheriff's department raiding Loren's home. Panicked, Rowan snatched up a few essentials, cash, an extra set of clothes, Loren's notes, and made her way to the back door and ran a mile into the forest. She emerged disoriented and adrenalized, knowing she had to keep moving. With limited options, Rowan made the difficult decision to go back to her parents' home. The place she'd left behind months ago felt foreign, almost like a step back in time. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorbell, her mind racing through the possible outcomes of this uncomfortable reunion. The door creaked open, and her mother stood there, eyes widening in disbelief, then narrowing with something Rowan couldn't quite read. Anger, suspicion. "Rowan, is that you?" Her mother's voice trembled, emotions cascading over each other like confused waves. "Yes, Mum. It's me," Rowan stammered, struggling to maintain her composure. Without another word, her mother stepped aside, letting Rowan enter the home. The familiarity of the space clashed violently with how alien Rowan felt, like a book that no longer fit on its old shelf. Her father entered the room, and his expression spoke volumes. A turbulent mix of joy, shock, and, unmistakably, concern. Rowan felt a chill crawl down her spine as her father spoke, a tinge of sternness lining his voice. "We saw you on the news, Rowan. They are hunting you now because you slipped away from questioning at the sheriff's department. That's a serious matter." The words hung heavily in the air, like an unsolved puzzle everyone was avoiding. Her mother's face was etched with a complex mixture of concern, relief, and growing apprehension. "Rowan, we're your parents. We're supposed to protect you. But how can we do that if we don't know what's going on? You've slipped through the hands of the law, and you're here now, which puts us all at risk." The gravity of the situation settled over Rowan like a dark cloud. She had come seeking sanctuary, but had instead introduced a new set of complications into the lives of her parents. The tension in her family home was palpable, thick enough to slice through. So it was an agonizing irony. She'd returned to the one place that was supposed to feel like home, only to find it fraught with unfamiliar dangers and old wounds reopened. Her voice faltered as she looked into the eyes of the two people who had raised her, who had no reason to trust this new version of their daughter, with her hidden secrets and half-truths. "I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go, but I understand I've put you both in a difficult situation." The father leaned back, his eyes studying her as though searching for traces of the daughter he once knew. "Then tell us, Rowan. Help us understand, because right now you're a stranger standing in our home." Caught between her former life and her current shadowy existence, Rowan knew that whatever happened next would irreversibly change the course of her relationship with her parents, and perhaps her own life as well. She took a deep breath, readying herself to bridge the worlds she had been straddling for too long. Rowan looked at her parents, the silence thickening with every second that passed. Finally, she extended her hand, inviting them to touch her skin. Her mother hesitated before tentatively laying her hand on Rowan's. She felt her mother's breath catch as she touched the icy, lifeless surface that had replaced the warm skin she remembered. "Feel that? It's not just cold weather. It's not just a condition. It's what I am now," Rowan said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. Her eyes shifted from their familiar brown hue to a crimson color, glowing subtly in the dim light of the room. Her father stepped back involuntarily, gripping the armrest of his chair. Rowan's voice was soft but deliberate as she broke the news. "I'm a vampire. Loren changed me one night while I was investigating the deaths at the abandoned mill. You always wondered why I took a job at the funeral home, didn't you? At first it was my passion, but since my changing I realized it's because I would be feeding off the dead so that I don't have to kill the living. Funny how fate works. But Loren, he's more complicated." Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, and her father's face was an unreadable mix of horror, confusion, and a futile attempt to understand. For a moment, everyone was still, as if frozen in time. Just then, the door slammed open and Rowan's sister Natalie stormed in, her eyes darting from her parents to Rowan. "What's going on?" Her eyes widened as they met Rowan's crimson gaze. A blood-curdling scream escaped Natalie's lips as she backed away. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Natalie's voice trembled with a combination of fear and anger. "You're the reason everything's falling apart." Rowan took a step forward, her voice laced with regret and familial affection, albeit strained. "Natalie, I never wanted this, but we don't get to choose the cards we're dealt." "You always have a choice," Natalie snapped, her eyes brimming with tears. "I overheard what you said, You're talking about feeding off the dead like it's some sort of ethical compromise. What's next? Will you start justifying murder?" Tension between the sisters boiled over, each word another log thrown onto the emotional fire that had been stoked in the room. Their parents looked on, torn between the daughters they thought they knew and the stranger that one had become. Rowan's voice broke as she addressed her sister. "I'm still me, Nat. I'm still your sister. The core of who I am hasn't changed." Natalie's expression softened momentarily, only to harden again. "Maybe that's what terrifies me the most, Rowan. Because if you can become this, what hope is there for the rest of us?" The room was filled with a heavy, heartbreaking silence. Rowan felt the distance between herself and her family expand into an insurmountable chasm, each look of confusion, fear, and disappointment etching itself onto her undead heart. The revelation had shattered the illusion of any remaining normality, the fragments of her former life now scattered and unreachable. So it was a natural pause, but one filled with a gravity that pulled all their lives into question. Rowan was caught in an impossible moment, looking at the faces of a family she felt both bound to and estranged from. The enormity of it all was overwhelming, and for the first time since her transformation, Rowan felt genuinely lost. Meanwhile, so Loren moved through the night, each step a mixture of urgency and caution. Gone were the days when he could blend into the crowd, a nondescript face among many. Now he was the face people saw in their nightmares, the lurking fear in every shadow. With his transformation into something darker, more primal, he felt both liberated and shackled, free from the constraints of his human self, but bound by the ever-growing urge to hunt, to consume. Even in the relative darkness, he could feel the eyes upon him, eyes that were virtual before, now replaced by real, vigilant gazes. The community had mobilized against him. Religious groups cited him as a living testament to end-of-days prophecies, and local hunters had put aside their differences to find and kill the monster in their midst. Loren moved through the underbrush, his senses heightened, his mind a swirling vortex of instincts and urges. This forest was a sanctuary, a place where he could unleash the monster within without judgment. But tonight, it felt like a prison, closing in on him with each step he took. Just as he was contemplating his next move, a rustling sound came from a nearby thicket. Out stepped Vona, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Unlike others who may have been horrified by his transformation, Vona looked almost pleased, satisfied in a dark, twisted way. "You've truly embraced what you are, haven't you?" Vona said, her voice laced with something that sounded almost like pride. Loren's face tightened. "Don't act like this is some kind of gift. You set this in motion, Vona." She grinned, revealing a hint of fang. "And isn't it beautiful, the monster you've become?" His anger surged, momentarily overpowering the darker instincts that drove him. "Beautiful. People are hunting me like an animal, and Rowan. She's in danger because of this. This curse." Vona's smile didn't waver. "You say curse. I say evolution. But whatever you want to call it, Loren, you don't have to go through it alone. Join the coven. With us, you'll be among those who understand, those who've embraced the darkness." As he listened, Loren's thoughts flickered to Rowan. They talked about this, planned for it. The idea of infiltrating the coven to find out what they were really up to. This was the opportunity they'd been waiting for. Taking a deep, unnecessary breath, Loren said, "All right, Vona, take me to the coven." A triumphant gleam lit up her eyes. "You won't regret this." They walked in silence, but it was far from comfortable. With each step, Loren felt the weight of his decision. He was aligning himself with beings he barely understood, led by a woman who saw his monstrous transformation as some kind of vindication. Finally, they reached a hidden enclave, skillfully concealed by nature and enchantments. As they entered, Vona looked at him, her gaze possessive, as if she'd claimed him as her own property. "Welcome, Loren. Welcome to the rest of your eternal life," she whispered, her eyes shining with dark satisfaction. As Loren Vona stepped further into the enclave, he felt eyes on him. Dozens of them, all belonging to the members of the Coven. Their gazes ranged from curious to suspicious, from intrigued to openly hostile. The murmur of their conversations filled the air like the ominous hum of a swarm of bees. "Silence, everyone," Vona commanded, her voice echoing through the chamber. The chatter ceased. "I bring before you Loren, a new member of our esteemed Coven, and one who has fully embraced the depths of his transformation." Though the room remained hushed, Loren could feel the weight of unspoken questions, of whispers yet to be uttered. He was an outsider here, a potential threat or ally, and the Coven couldn't yet decide which. Vona seemed oblivious to the tension, or perhaps just indifferent to it. She led Loren to a makeshift throne at the head of the enclave, a seat intricately carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. "Sit," she purred, gesturing toward the throne. "Is this seat not reserved for the leader?" Loren questioned, cautious not to seem too eager. Vona laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Loren's spine. "Consider it an honor, a taste of the power you could wield within our ranks." Loren reluctantly took the seat, keenly aware of how this scene must look to the rest of the Coven. Like a man willingly stepping into the spider's web. Over the next several hours, Vona presented Loren with numerous temptations designed to bind him to her and the Coven. Luxuries that appealed to base desires. Promises of power that could extend his influence far beyond the hidden confines of their lair. And finally, offers of a more intimate nature. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of lust and challenge as she leaned close, whispering promises of ecstatic experiences only beings of their kind could appreciate. Each offer made Loren's insides twist, a mix of temptation and revulsion. Remembering Rowan, remembering their plan, he resisted. Yet he knew he had to tread carefully. Outright rejection could arouse suspicion. Excessive enthusiasm could signal deception. "I need time to consider all of this," he finally said, hoping to strike the right balance. Vona pulled back, her eyes narrowing. "Of course! You'll have your own quarters in the meantime." With a wave of her hand, a member of the Coven, a tall, gaunt figure who moved with the grace of a predator, escorted Loren to a room adorned with the same twisting, unsettling symbols that were etched into the throne. As the door closed behind him, Loren realized he was truly alone for the first time since his transformation. Alone and surrounded by beings who were, in all likelihood, as dangerous as the monster he felt growing inside him. The walls seemed to close in as he considered his options. He needed to play this smartly to gain their trust without losing himself in the process. Back in his private chamber, Loren could almost hear the whispers start up again, spreading through the Coven like wildfire. The word intruder seemed to hang in the air, unspoken but ever present. His senses, sharp as they were, picked up on their skepticism, their curiosity. Who is he? They must be asking each other. Why is he here? Can we trust him? For now, Loren could only prepare himself for what was to come. His mission to gain the Coven's trust, to find out their ultimate plans, and to protect Rowan had never seemed more perilous. In the darkness of his new quarters, Loren could feel the edges of his control fraying. The room seemed to contract and expand in response to his hunger, the pulsating walls mirroring the tempest of his inner world. He replayed his conversations with Vona, their implications, and his own conflicted desires, seeking any insight that might guide him through this maze of treachery and temptation. The door creaked softly, and before he could turn, he felt her, Vona, her presence invading the room like a dark mist. She glided in, the door closing quietly behind her, and stopped just inches away from him. The air between them seemed to crackle with electric tension. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured, her eyes taking on another worldly glow. "Neither could I." "What are you doing here?" Loren questioned, his voice more curt than he had intended. Vona grinned, a smirk that was both alluring and menacing. "I've come to help you make your decision, to give you a taste of what being part of this coven could be like." Her hand touched his face, and and Loren felt a jolt of something. Fear, desire, a cocktail of both. He fought to keep his reaction neutral, to not give her the satisfaction of seeing his inner turmoil. Resisting the pull is fruitless, Vona cooed, especially when you're this new to our kind's ways. I can make you forget all about your struggles, Loren. Loren felt her other hand glide to the nape of his neck, her fingers tracing the sensitive skin there. Her face was now so close to his, he could feel her cool breath against his lips. His resolve weakened. It was getting harder to think. Feed from me, she whispered, tilting her head slightly to expose her neck. Embrace the pleasure of our union. For a second, Loren was tempted. The scent of her, that tantalizing aroma that promised not just sustenance but ecstasy, filled his nostrils. It would be so easy to give in, to let go, and for that moment, be free from the gnawing hunger, the relentless craving. But then, thoughts of Rowan flooded back, and with them, his reason. I can't, he choked out. Vona's eyes narrowed. Can't or won't. Loren could feel her cool fingertips pressing into his skin now, as though threatening to puncture it. Both, he finally said. I can't because I won't. I won't betray myself or anyone else. For a moment, Vona looked truly dangerous, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and something else, disappointment. Then, with a breath, she composed herself, her expression melting into one of calculated calm. You're playing a dangerous game, Loren, she said softly, withdrawing her hands and stepping back. In this coven, refusing an offering like this could have consequences. Loren nodded, fully aware of the precipice he was navigating. I understand, but my answer remains the same. Vona paused at the door, casting a final, inscrutable glance over her shoulder. Very well, but remember, Loren games have winners and losers. Make sure you're the former. With that, she was gone, leaving Loren alone once more. A man haunted by choices, by love and by a future teetering dangerously on the edge of a knife. Meanwhile, Rowan had been flipping through the notes Loren had recorded over time and grabbed her cell phone and booked her flight, remaining true to the plan despite the opposition. Before her flight to Montana, Rowan had been engulfed in a whirlwind of emotions. Her parents, still reeling from the revelations of her new life and the monstrous identity, looked at her with a blend of concern, confusion, and deep-rooted love as she prepared to leave. I have to go, Rowan said, struggling to keep her voice steady. There's someone who might have information, answers to questions I've been trying to piece together. Maybe even a way to stop all of this. Her mother looked like she was on the verge of tears. Can't the authorities handle this? You're already in enough trouble, Rowan. Rowan hesitated, searching her mother's eyes for understanding. This is something only I can do. If the authorities could have handled Vona, they would have done it by now. Please trust me. Her father sighed. We love you, Rowan. You know that. But you're stepping into dangerous territory, and we're worried. I'm always in dangerous territory, she replied softly. This is my life now, and I have to face it head on. Her parents embraced her, their warmth a stark contrast to the chill that always seemed to radiate from her now. Be careful, her father whispered. And for the first time in a long time, Rowan felt the weight of her family's love wrapped around her like a protective shield. It was with that shield that she left and drove to the local airport and boarded her flight. Before she stepped onto the plane, she looked around and sighed, and eventually found herself in Montana, sitting across from Dr. Gareth Fields in his research facility just outside Bozeman. Secluded in a small room filled with books, manuscripts, and artifacts, they began to pore over Loren's handwritten notes, maps, and the cryptic symbols he'd sketched. Hours seemed to pass in minutes as they pieced together Loren's research, comparing it with ancient texts and Dr. Fields' own extensive findings. Rowan was the first to stumble upon the reference to Vona. Here it says she is descended from Sumerian bloodlines, going back thousands of years. Sumeria, as in ancient Mesopotamia. Is that even possible? Dr. Fields removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes before putting them back on. More than you might think. Vona isn't just an average vampire. She's an ancient one, possibly one of the first. And if she's been active for millennia, her influence could extend far beyond what we've considered. But that would also mean the name you have been calling her is a modern guise, and her true identity still remains elusive. The room went quiet, save for the muffled sound of the wind howling outside. Rowan felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with her vampiric nature. "Then we really need to figure out how to stop her," Rowan whispered. Dr. Fields nodded gravely. This wasn't just about Rowan or Loren anymore. The stakes were much higher than she'd ever imagined. Rowan was immersed in the scrolls and dusty books that seemed to span the entire history of human civilization, as seen through the dark lens of vampirism. She felt both enlightened and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information that Dr. Fields had amassed. As they were poring over another cryptic text, Dr. Fields sighed, looking up from the parchment. "You know, a lot of these records, especially the ones that focus on ancient bloodlines like Vona's, were given to me by a vampire I met in the Middle East." Rowan looked up sharply. "You met a vampire during your travels and lived to tell the tale?" Dr. Fields chuckled, a deep sound that had little mirth in it. "Yes, I did. You're not the only vampire who's ever been curious about their own history, you know? Some want to understand themselves as much as we do." Rowan looked up sharply, locking eyes with Dr. Fields. "Wait, how did you know I'm a vampire? I've been careful to not give anything away." Dr. Fields chuckled, the sound echoing in the room filled with ancient texts and parchments. "Oh, my dear, you underestimate the keen observations of a man who's devoted his life to studying your kind. It's not just one thing, but a combination of subtleties that gave you away." Rowan felt uneasy, suddenly aware of herself. "Like what?" "For starters, the cold emanating from your presence is quite unlike the warmth that living humans have. It's not something everyone would notice, but to someone like me, it's quite telling." He paused as if contemplating whether to continue. Finally, he said, "Then there are your eyes, so sharp, so aware, unlike the eyes of someone burdened by the frailties of human existence. And perhaps most telling is your breath, or lack thereof. You don't breathe unless you want to." Rowan felt a chill go down her spine. She'd underestimated Dr. Fields. If he was this observant, she couldn't afford to let her guard down for a moment. She met his eyes squarely. "Is this information you're going to share with others?" Dr. Fields shook his head emphatically. "Absolutely not. My goal is to understand, not to endanger. You came here for knowledge, and that's what I intend to provide. However, I felt it was necessary for you to know that, when dealing with an expert, it's nearly impossible to hide what you are." Rowan sighed, feeling both relieved and slightly violated. It was unsettling to know that she could be read so easily by a human. But Dr. Fields wasn't just any human. He was an expert in her condition, a condition she was still trying to fully comprehend herself. Dr. Fields put down the scroll he had been examining. "Well, from what you've told me, Loren was researching this as well. Perhaps he was searching for something, answers maybe, or a solution to a problem he couldn't solve." Rowan nodded, the pain in her chest tightening. "Or creating a problem he couldn't control." "There's that possibility too," Dr. Fields admitted. "But back to the vampire I met. He gave me a cache of texts and scrolls, some of which I still haven't fully translated. They're coded, filled with layers of allegory and metaphor. But one thing is clear, the ancient vampires were a completely different breed. They were closer to gods than the creatures we commonly think of today." Rowan's eyes widened. "Gods? You mean like immortal beings worshipped by ancient civilizations?" "Precisely. There are records, still untranslated, that hint at a vampiric presence behind several ancient deities. If Vona really is a descendant of such a lineage, then she might be far more powerful than we can even imagine." A heavy silence settled between them, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Rowan felt the enormity of what they were discussing press down upon her. Here she was in the heart of Montana, uncovering secrets that stretched back millennia, secrets that could potentially change not just her life, but the fate of humanity itself. "Then we need to decode those texts," Rowan said finally, "before it's too late." Dr. Fields nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a weighty understanding. "Yes, we do, and we need to do it fast. Time, I suspect, is not on our side." Rowan felt a renewed sense of urgency. With a quiet resolve, she turned back to the parchments, driven by the weight of the dangerous secrets they held. These ancient texts might be the key to unraveling the web of complexity that Loren had spun around both of them. And time was running out. Meanwhile, Loren sat alone in the dimly lit room that served as his quarters in the Coven's hideaway. The walls, made of dark stone, seemed to close in on him, much like the ever-tightening knot of his situation. He could hear the distant laughter and chatter of the Coven, a constant reminder that he was an outsider among them. He had avoided their gatherings, avoided Vona, and most of all, avoided feeding. But his vampire nature was catching up with him. The thirst was becoming unbearable. His thoughts always circled back to Rowan. What was she doing now? Was she safe? The silence of his phone was a poor indicator, but he knew contacting her would jeopardize both their positions. He was here for a reason, to infiltrate the Coven, gather information, and hopefully find a way to dismantle this twisted community from the inside. But the cost of this mission was proving to be higher than he'd expected. The door to his quarters creaked open. Vona stepped in, as if on cue, radiating confidence and a dark allure that had ensnared so many before him. Still sulking, Loren, she purred, stepping closer to him. Loren looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He could see that Vona was more than just intrigued by him. She considered him a challenge, a puzzle to be solved and claimed. "You've been starving yourself," she said, almost as an accusation. "You can't keep this up. You know it as well as I do." Loren felt the corners of his mouth twitch, a vain attempt to form a smile that wouldn't come. "What do you want, Vona?" Vona moved closer, her hand reaching out to caress his face. "I want you to stop fighting what you are and accept the gifts that come with it. The power, the pleasure, and me." In that moment, driven by a thirst he could no longer bear, Loren relented. He allowed himself to feed from Vona, to tap into the lifeblood that would nourish and strengthen him. As he drank, he felt the immediate rush, the heightened senses, the return of his vigor. Vona didn't stop there. She pulled him close, her eyes locking onto his as she initiated a passionate encounter in which Loren gave in. Vona took advantage and used Loren for her personal sexual gratification as they spent the day entangled in dark lust. Overwhelmed by his own physical needs and the haze of her seductive energy, Loren continued to give in to the moment. But as the intensity of the experience faded, replaced by the hollow echo of his own thoughts, Loren felt a sense of regret wash over him. This wasn't what he wanted. His true self, the core of Loren, had been overshadowed by the animalistic needs of his vampire nature. And throughout the entire time he'd been with Vona, his mind had been filled with thoughts of Rowan. Her smile, her touch, her essence. She was the one he truly wanted, the one he had compromised himself for, and the one he had to protect at all costs. Yet here he was, in a room far away from her, filled with a sorrow he couldn't shake and a decision he couldn't take back.